Hi, and welcome to week 7, in which we're going to begin our look at internal analysis. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is, where does internal analysis fit in terms of our strategic management journey? Well, you will have seen, and you ought to be aware of this general process. So in the first part of this module with Mark Taylor, you've really focused on looking at the external environment. You've also looked with Mark at expectations and purposes. So what is the mission? What is the purpose of the organisation? How do stakeholders affect the shaping of these perspectives? Because expectations and purpose also have a bearing on what an organisation intends to do and is going to do in the future. But with Mark, you will have looked at the external environment, and the key tool, and one of the key tools for doing this, obviously, is PESTEL. And the purpose of PESTEL analysis, if we take it down to its most basic level, if we reduce down the knowledge that we acquire and the insights that we acquire through external analysis, is that it enables us to say, well, what opportunities and threats confront the organisation, and which are so important that the organisation must take account of these factors when it develops its strategy. What we're going to look at, and what I'm going to introduce you to this week, is internal analysis. So initially, I'm going to explain the process for internal analysis and why it's important, and some of the key management and academic concepts. But I'm also going to introduce you to the key tool for this part of the module, or the key tools, because you'll have an option of using either a functional analysis or something called a value chain analysis. And all these tools do is they are a framework which allow us to understand the functions or the activities of firms, and to identify where they are doing well in these functions or activities and where they're not doing so well in these functions or activities. And therefore, by implication, we'll be able to assess where they have strengths and where they have weaknesses. And the real purpose of strengths and weaknesses analysis in strategic management is, okay, how can an organisation build on or leverage or exploit its strengths? And where it has weaknesses which are strategically significant, what can it do to overcome those weaknesses, to turn those weaknesses into strengths in order to allow it to pursue opportunities in the environment? Or how does it build strengths where there are weaknesses in order to become less susceptible to threats? There's also an option of how can it pursue strategies which make its weaknesses irrelevant. Okay, so once we've done this, once we've completed internal analysis and we've identified strengths and weaknesses, we can put that alongside the opportunities and threats that you've identified in the first part of this module, and we can summarise this in a SWOT analysis. So a lot of you will have heard of SWOT before, and quite simply, SWOT is a summary of the strategic position of the organisation. So it allows the organisation to say, what strengths and weaknesses do we have, and how does that put us, or how does that place us in terms of the opportunities and threats in the external environment which confront us. So the strategic position really is the answer to two of the three key strategic questions. And the two questions are, where are we now? So what is our current position in terms of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats? And the work that you've done with Mark on expectations and purposes in the first part of the module will also allow you to have some kind of perspective on where we want to go. What is your organisation's purpose, its mission statement? What are its key strategic objectives? What is it aiming to do overall? Okay, so this is where what we are going to do this week and for the next couple of weeks fits in. We're going to do internal analysis, which is looking inside the organisation, what's going on inside the organisation to identify strengths and weaknesses. So, 3 fairly simple learning outcomes for this week. The first thing I want to talk to you about is understanding the role of internal analysis in strategy formulation. We've talked about where it fits in with the strategy process, about where are we now. Okay, so hopefully you've got some insight into that, and we'll develop that further as the lecture goes on. We need to also understand the relationship between the resources an organisation has, the competencies it develops, and how that allows organisations to achieve success. Okay, so one of the things we say in strategy is it allows us to understand why some organisations are successful and some organisations are not successful. An internal analysis says, well, at least part of the answer to that question is what resources and competencies has an organisation acquired and has an organisation developed. Okay. Then the final thing I want to do, which is critical in terms of you moving forward as managers and you completing your assignments, is I want to introduce you to some tools and frameworks for carrying out internal analysis. And because in this module we allow you to pick a wide range of organisations, what we should understand is not all organisations have got the same expectations and purposes, missions. They're not all trying to do the same things. They operate in different industries, and the resources that are required and the competencies or the business processes that are required in those different sectors of the sport industry and for organisations with different objectives will be different. So we need different frameworks for analysing where organisations need to be successful. So let's start off with just saying why internal analysis is important. Well, first of all, and some of these may seem quite obvious, but let's just talk through them quickly. It helps us understand the strengths that the organisation has developed in order to be successful, right? So it helps us understand what contributes to business success in the sport industry. Why do some organisations succeed? Okay. It also helps us to understand weaknesses that contribute to a lack of success or even failure. Okay, so why do some organisations succeed while some fail? And one of the things about strategic management is it takes a kind of holistic look at. In some ways, it's a capstone module. It looks at the different management functions of marketing, human resource management, finance, operations, and many other areas. And it kind of says, well, how do these functions combine together to create success or failure? So it helps you understand business in the round, and it helps you understand in different areas of industry what things contribute to success and what things contribute to failure. An internal analysis through an understanding of strengths and weaknesses is really important in order to enable us to do that. Now, once we've done this, as we've said, it helps us complete the situational analysis picture, yeah? The strategic position of where we are now. Where are we now? What are the strengths and weaknesses that we've got, and how do they match up to the opportunities and threats that confront us? So it allows us then to be in a position to complete SWOT analysis. And in future weeks, when we come to look at strategic options, I'll introduce you to a tool called TOES analysis. And TOES analysis just looks at the relationship between different SWOT categories. So let me give you a couple of examples. TOES analysis looks at the synergy between different SWOT sectors. So for example, it says, what strengths do we have, and which of our strengths have great synergy or match up well with opportunities in the external environment? So how can we use some of our strengths to pursue opportunities in the environment. Now, not every organisation is going to have the right strengths to pursue opportunities in the environment. So strengths, opportunities, environments are called SO strategies in TOES analysis. But as I said, not every organisation has got the right strength, so it might need to look at overcoming weaknesses. So another section of TOES analysis would be WO strategies. And WO strategies would be, how do we overcome weaknesses that we have that are closing off great opportunities for us? So WO strategies are about overcoming weaknesses. Okay, so SWOT and TOES analysis are the starting point of strategic options decision making, which is going to really be the final part of this module, and which we will move on to after we've completed internal analysis over the next couple of weeks. So internal analysis assesses the resources an organisation has or doesn't have. Yeah? So we're going to look at resources. It's going to look at what an organisation can or cannot do, what it is competent to do and what it is not competent to do. So we're going to look at something called competencies. So it's not just about the resources that an organisation has, it's how it can actually deploy those resources. And the deployment of resources requires processes and management activity and processes, yeah, which are competencies. So the strengths that an organisation has, quite simply then, are the resources an organisation possesses and the competencies it has developed. So let's be clear, when I say competencies, I mean the activities or processes that create competitive advantage for an organisation or superior performance. Now, why do I say competitive advantage or superior performance? Well, competitive advantage applies to those organisations who operate in the commercial sector. Okay, and competitive advantage means that you have a series of strengths which allow you to generate superior profits to your competitors. Okay, but what we know about the sport industry, it doesn't just operate in the commercial sector. There is an important public, government and voluntary organisation element to the industry. And, you know, I come from this area of industry, and we didn't talk about competitive advantage when I worked in government sport. We talked about creating partnerships in order to increase participation, not to crush the competition. That doesn't make sense. But what we talked about was getting better, continuous improvement or superior performance. So we wanted to continuously improve to reach superior performance in order to achieve our objectives, which weren't about making a profit, which were about maximising participation. But we'll talk more about that as this part of the module develops. And then quite simply, weaknesses are resources or competence the organisation lacks or is deficient in. So, what problems do students face thinking about your assignments and thinking about looking at the organisations you need to conduct internal analysis on? Well, what I'm going to say to you is it's actually quite different than doing external analysis. So when I worked in industry and I was responsible for strategy in a number of organisations I worked in, then I was actually not in as good position as you are as students at Sheffield Hallam University to have access to data to be able to assess external environmental threats. The university for you buys resources in the forms of things like Mintel, Euromonitor or Passport, and many other databases which give you access to really good market intelligence, which is created by specialist companies. I didn't have that when I worked for Nottingham City Council and Sheffield City Council. Our budgets didn't stretch to the subscriptions that are required to access those kinds of reports. You know, to buy a single Mintel report, you're talking about £1,500 to £2,000. Now, you have access to maybe 10 relevant Mintel reports, plus passport reports and other sources, which I didn't have. Okay. But the advantage I had when I was doing internal analysis for those organisations was that I was inside the organisation. Now, I needed to be objective about from being inside the organisation. So you've got to have objectivity when you are working from inside the organisation about not saying we're great at everything. You need a warts and all kind of view. But I was in a different position than you. You will be looking from the outside in. And this creates problems for you because a lot of the information needed to carry out a full internal analysis is buried deep in the organisation, in its culture, which can be difficult to understand unless you're actually in it. And it's difficult to experience that as a student, working from your desk, rather than being inside the organisation. You need to understand operations processes, which often aren't documented or processed or written about, and perhaps some confidential and sensitive data. So what I will talk to you about through this process and through these lectures is what it is reasonable for us to expect from you when we ask you to conduct internal analysis. Okay, and what I'll say is we will introduce you to a range of tools, approaches, and how to do internal analysis to equip you to do this as you move beyond Sheffield Hallam University and hopefully into management in the sport industry or in general business anyway. We can ask you to take reasonable steps to carry out research into available information, and within this presentation I'll talk to you about sources, but definitely in the live seminars, the face-to-face sessions that we do, the live online sessions that we do, we will talk about information sources that you can use to help you complete internal analysis. But we will acknowledge that because the fact that the information is quite often buried deep in the organisation, there are limitations on you, and it will not be possible for you to do a perfect internal analysis, but we can certainly set you on the way to doing a very, very good internal analysis. Okay, so I want to put internal analysis in a bit of kind of context now, and perhaps a more theoretical context. So in previous weeks you will have seen that the environment for the sport industry is complex and there are lots of factors, and it's a dynamic industry. So currently you will be wrestling with completing external analysis, and you'll see there are lots and lots and lots of factors. Okay, and one of the things that you will see is that, you know, perhaps the external environment is complex and perhaps dangerous. Okay, so faced with these conditions of environmental uncertainty and a complex environment, what can or should organisations do to help them deal with the external environment? Well, some theorists in the area of strategic management advocate what's called the resource-based approach to strategy. And what this really means is that when the external environment is subject to this kind of complexity and rapid change, internal resources and capabilities offer a more secure basis for strategy than market focus. So what does that really mean? It means organisations shouldn't be constantly chasing shadows in an external environment which is very difficult to follow and predict. They should look inside and kind of think, okay, let's build our own strengths. Let's focus on what we need to do in order to be successful. And this is the resource-based view of strategy. Okay, and it says that resources and capability are the primary sources of profitability and success. So the resource-based view of strategy is quite different than Michael Porter and the positioning school of strategy. And Michael Porter says that when you do Porter's 5 forces, you are trying to identify industry attractiveness. And there are certain industries that are less attractive than others because of the strength of competitive forces. So the airline industry is a classic one. It is difficult to make profits in the airline industry and to succeed and last in the airline industry because the forces are all high. Yeah, the threats are all high. So Porter would say, if you're business and you're looking to expand into new areas, don't expand into the airline industry. Position yourself in another area, in another business. Okay, so the positioning school says, look at the external environment, including the industry environment, and position yourself accordingly. The resource-based view says, it's difficult to do that because of complexity and uncertainty in the environment. And in order to generate superior profits, you need to look at developing competitive advantage through acquiring superior resources and capabilities, which will lead you to success in the longer term. And so this is a typical quote from a resource-based view theorist, so Peterath, who says that a major contribution of the resource-based model is that it explains long-lived differences in firm profitability that cannot be attributed to differences in industry conditions. So this makes perfect sense if we think about it. There are organisations who compete in the same industry, so they're all faced with the same pastel macro environmental factors and the same industry factors. Okay, so what explains their success or the differences in success between different businesses in the same industry who are faced with the same external conditions? Well, the resource-based view says it comes down to the strengths that they have and the resources and the competencies that they have developed strengths in. That's what explains long-term profitability or long-term success. Okay, so just to conclude Screencast 1, the most important things to say is that internal analysis is about the SW of SWOT analysis, and it forms therefore one of the first parts of any strategic assessment of an organisation. And internal analysis is related to understanding and analysing how the organisation develops and leverages its competitive advantage. So competitive advantage via internal analysis is generated through resources and competencies. And in the subsequent screencasts that we'll look at, we're going to explore this in more detail.